Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Helen Seslowski. I'm the events director for Oblong Books, an independent bookstore in New York's Hudson Valley. If you have questions for our panelists at any time during the program this evening, please type them into the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A module, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of the conversation portion of the program. We're very pleased to welcome Rebecca Mead, who is joining us this evening from Naples, Italy, to talk to us about her new memoir, Homeland, a memoir of departure and return, which is published by Knopf and available in both our stores and online through oblongbooks.com. Rebecca's memoir raises poignant questions about place. What does it mean to leave the place you have adopted as home and country? And what is the value and cost of uprooting yourself? Rebecca Mead has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1997. She's profiled many subjects and has contributed more than 200 pieces to the talk of the town. She's the author of One Perfect Day and My Life in Middlemarch, a New York Times bestseller. She has served as a McGraw Professor of Writing at Princeton University and is the recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship. Conducting the conversation with Rebecca this evening is Gideon Lewis-Kraus. A staff writer for The New Yorker, Gideon writes reportage and criticism and is the author of the digressive travel memoir, A Sense of Direction. Previously, he was writer-at-large at the New York Times Magazine, a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, and a contributing writer at Wired Magazine. He teaches a reporting seminar in the graduate writing program at Columbia University, and he joins us this evening from Brooklyn, New York. Welcome to you both. I'll hand over to you, Gideon, now to start us off.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that lovely introduction. And welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. It's my great pleasure to be here with a writer and colleague whom I very much admire and have been reading for a very long time. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with Rebecca. So Rebecca, instead of asking you first, assuming that our audience has not yet had the occasion and good fortune to read the book, instead of asking you to talk about what the book is about, which over the last couple of months since I've read this, I found myself referring to this book all the time, but it's not always so easy to articulate exactly how it works. It's a book you sort of have to experience rather than just hear about. But can you, instead of starting with the what, can you start with the how? Can you tell us how this book came about, where this came from, how you started working on it, and when you realized that this was a book?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you. And thanks, Helen, for that lovely introduction. So the book is a memoir that I wrote in the aftermath of leaving New York City, where I lived for 30 years, and returning to London, which is the city of my birth, although it's not the city in which I really ever lived, except for in my earliest childhood. My family and I decided to move at a certain point 3 or 4 years ago now. But when does a move become a book? I mean, or when does anything become a book? I suppose it is when one starts to realize that there is something in the experience that one wants to process in the way that, you and I know how, which is writing it out and trying to think it through in words. The very first genesis of the book was a piece I wrote for The New Yorker in the summer of 2018, which is when I left New York. And I wrote this piece about leaving. And it was really, in a way, it was like a defense. It was a mea culpa, or, why was I leaving? Why was I bailing out, or whatever it was I was doing? And it was a piece about having become an American citizen, which I did do in 2011, and then deciding to leave the country that I had claimed as my own, and that I, in some ways, had thought I would stay in forever. And doing so in the wake of the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and witnessing all of the things that were happening and beginning to question, these things that were being done really in my name as well as in yours, because I was now and still am an American citizen. So that piece was sort of a cri de coeur and quite political and very upset and angry. The book isn't tonally the same, and it's not as political explicitly. It is much more about, this very peculiar experience of returning to a place that I come from, but from which I've been distant for so long that it had become strange to me and foreign to me, and that I had become foreign in it. So I think I was, when I had returned to London, there were so many things that struck me, and they weren't, they weren't narrative things, they weren't stories exactly, they were more about mood or sense, or a sense of imagination and how history fitted into the present, and just really more to do with mood than anything else. And that was what I wanted to try to capture while it was still fresh in my experience and fresh in my mind. The longer you stay, the more ordinary something becomes. But just little things like the way that my footstep sounds different on a sidewalk in London because of the kind of stone that the sidewalk is made of. And there's this sound that brings me back to childhood that is totally different from the sound of your footfall on asphalt in New York, which is the sound of my 20s and 30s and 40s even. So just noticing things like that was something that I wanted to kind of capture and explore. So that's how the idea for a book came about.
So, I mean, one of the things that's so wonderful about this book is that it really feels like a description of how the textures of one's life come together and come to cohere in a way that one wouldn't necessarily have imagined. And as you said, I think putting it as a book about mood is obviously exactly right. So, but then the question is, if there are these kinds of moods that you want to create for a book like this that is largely about connections and coincidences and relationships that unfold over time, in a way that's almost like Sebald or something, how did you then decide which of these things made sense as set pieces? Because presumably you sort of, anything could have been like fed into like the grist of that mill. I mean, obviously that sounds cynical. I don't mean it cynically. I'm just saying, like, what then, how did you know that something belonged in this book and why versus something that didn't belong in this book?
Yeah, well, some of that was trial and error. I mean, some of it was writing things that I thought might work and then ended up not being something that I wanted to end up putting in the book. I wrote a whole section that was about the way that Britain was poised at the moment that we came back. The Brexit vote had happened, but Brexit had not been executed. The voice of the people, the very small majority of the people, had spoken and said we wanted to leave the EU, but how that was going to happen hadn't yet happened. And there was still some debate about whether, well, maybe it would be overturned and maybe there would be a second referendum. And I wrote and went on a couple of marches and went to sort of be in that moment of trying to stop the severing of my country from Europe. I ended up not writing about that because I didn't want to. I mean, I wrote it and then I ended up not using it because I didn't want the book to feel quite so tied to political. I didn't want it to be like a political diary of a period of time. I wanted it to feel like it could be happening at a different time, perhaps, or that it wouldn't feel quickly dated by historical events having come and gone. So I wrote more than I ended up using, which is something that I never do. I'm very economical with my writing, and I don't write more than I need to almost ever. I'm one of those people that I'm, assigned 6,000 words and I will write you 6,000 words and that's it, but this was much more trial and error and, will this work, will this not? And so that's confusing and difficult sometimes, but I wanted to write something that felt like a challenge to me. I could write New Yorker profiles ad infinitum, probably, if they would let me. But I wanted, if I'm writing a book, it has to be a different kind of thing, and it has to mean something different for me. So, yeah.
Tell me more about that. How did this feel different from your day job writing?
Well, it's very different in the sense that I'm writing about myself and my own experience. I'm writing about my family history. I'm writing about my relationship with my son. I'm writing about my feelings and my own past and my own experience. And I mean, as you know, when one writes for the New Yorker, you use the first person, and sometimes you use it quite a lot. But usually, when I write in the first person for the New Yorker, it's only to sort of get from one room to another, as it were. It's sort of, situating place or establishing a conversation with somebody. I said, he told me, those kinds of things. You don't most of the time write about, how, what this reporting experience made you feel. That's not what the job is. But this was, so this was very different. And there are some parts of the book that had an earlier life as reporting for the New Yorker, although very little of it is stuff that has appeared in the New Yorker. I mean, there may be a couple of lines somewhere that sort of appeared in the magazine at some point. But for example, I write a chapter about swimming, cold water swimming, which is something that I would never have dreamt of doing before moving to London. And then I live right by Hampstead Heath, where there are these cold water ponds that people swim in year round, which is something that I noticed lots of people were doing. And I started to swim in the summer and, wondered how far into the fall I could get, and then wondered how long into the winter I could get, and actually swam through the year. And that's now a thing I do. But I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about the phenomenon of British people going swimming in cold water, because it's a big thing in Britain. But when I wrote about it again in the book, it was really about the ways in which learning to tolerate swimming in freezing cold water felt for me while I was doing it like a metaphor for learning to reacclimatize myself to this chilly, water-surrounded country from which I come and to which I had returned. And it really felt very, very richly metaphorical. But that wouldn't have been really the New Yorker wouldn't have been the place to explore that. But I was glad to have another opportunity to go back and sort of do it over in a different way.
Well, did you feel, I mean, like how well are you able to compartmentalize those kinds of things in terms of like the self that you're bringing to any given piece of writing? I mean, do you feel like when you were that's probably a good example, when you were working on that as a New Yorker piece, did you feel as you were writing it, that, there's all this personal metaphorical dimension that I would want to explore, but, this isn't the place to put that in? Or do you feel like when you're writing the New Yorker version, you're bringing a certain kind of attitude to it where like those kinds of things just, don't even strike you as potentially relevant? Like, or do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they were, with the New Yorker piece, they're sort of there, but very, very submerged. And it wasn't a personal history piece. It wasn't about me and my new obsession with swimming. It was a piece about British culture, and yet there was a sense in which it was tied to the moment in Britain, and this sense of Britain as an island nation or conglomeration of countries, and this very profound sense of being surrounded by sea, which had become all the more significant because of Brexit, and this kind of temporal illusion that we had of being European and being connected to Europe had been repudiated, and there we were, just surrounded by waters again. So I was writing the piece at exactly the moment when the final Brexit sort of legislation was being passed, and so it was inflected with all of that for anybody that cared to notice it. But it wasn't so much about my personal drama with, metaphorically speaking, I'm out here stuck in the middle of this freezing cold water. What the hell am I doing here? And I might die. That feeling of, that's what it's like swimming. That's also a little bit what it's like moving back to Britain.
From the outside, at least, you're so unbelievably prolific at the New Yorker that it seems like you have just a superhuman capacity to do this reporting and to write, in such polished, beautiful ways so quickly. Was working on this book more difficult, less difficult in different ways than working on your New Yorker work?
It was much more difficult. It's the writing for the New Yorker is a tremendous privilege and usually a great joy, and I've been doing it a very long time and doing journalism a very long time, and I know what I'm doing more or less. I mean, I can do it better or worse under different circumstances, and I don't always know everything I'm doing, but I have a pretty good idea about how to go about doing these things now, and I can if I have to write, as I say, if I have to write 6,000 words, I can hold in my head the shape of a 6,000 word piece. I know kind of the rhythm of it and what the sense of it should be. So that's not that difficult. I mean, it's never easy, but it's not. I'm never left thinking, oh my God, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. But writing a book is a different speed of thing, and it's something I've done a lot less of, and each of my books has been very different. And there were the sort of the whole point of doing this book in a way was I didn't know what it was when I started. I had to sort of find my way through it from beginning to end, or in some sense from end to beginning. And there were lots of moments where I was didn't feel confident at all about what I was doing, which isn't it's not a nice feeling. I mean, it's nice to be in safe harbor doing what you know how to do, but then you also have to try to do something you don't know how to do.
Well, I mean, that's how the whole book starts off, is that you say that you were at a position where you felt like you could have continued on like the track that had been laid out before you, and you decide to start the whole, that you're going to unsettle your life and go on, on this life adventure. And so it makes sense that the book would feel like that kind of unsettling also.
Yeah. I mean, there were moments where I did feel like I could have written the book instead of as a memoir like it is. I could have I mean, I'm always thinking I should have done this as a comic novel. It would be writer moves to England thinking they're going to be able to enjoy the fruits of travel and variety, and then Brexit, pandemic, Boris Johnson. I mean, it's a joke, but anyway, maybe that'll be the next one. Will be the comic novel version of it.
And what did it feel like to write about your family?
It felt I mean, it's not easy, is it, writing about your family, I think, and then there are some of my family members I don't write about, but I write quite a bit about my parents. My father is dead, but my mother is still living, and I was quite nervous in showing the book to my mother. Not that I say anything bad about her, but it's her life, and it's conversations I've had with her that I'm exposing, and I have just taken them, and that's, you know, what writers do, and they, you know, claim the right to write about, claim the right to write about my experience, and where it intersects with hers, I hope she doesn't object. But you know, there was a lot about my father's family. My father was born in Camden in London, very, very close to where my husband and I now live, and we really didn't think about the fact that we were returning to my father's sort of place of birth until we got there, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, you know, I'm back. To the extent that there was a moment where, when I was looking for somewhere to live, somebody took me to a house that ended up being the backyard of this house, looked onto the back of the house that my father had first lived in when he was a child, which is so ridiculous in a city of however many millions of people there are in London, that, you know, it should come that, you know, the line of my life and the line of my father's life should cross in that way. But I didn't know that much about my father and my grandparents' London, and I had been gone from London. I've been gone from London since I was 3 years old, and I've been gone from England since I was 21. And there was so much I didn't know, that had I been around, I might have had conversations with them about, you know, those experiences of theirs. But going back and walking again through the streets where my parents lived and where my grandparents lived and my grandfather worked, and trying to, I have very little in the way of family documentation and family history. They're really, you know, not very much has survived. So there had to be quite a bit of sort of imaginative filling in of what these people, who they were and what they were like and what their lives might have been like. But that was very suggestive to me, to be walking around in these streets where I had family history, but no personal history. Well, you know, my life wasn't spent in those places. And, you know, unlike New York, where, you know, I spent so many years and had so many experiences, so many profound, you know, first experiences of my life in my youth, that, you know, it often feels like every corner in New York has a memory. I mean, you mentioned where you are, a few blocks from where I lived when I was in Brooklyn, and I can picture it, and I can, you know, imagine the, you know, I don't know, the drinks I had on that corner, or the argument I had across the street, or those things. And I had none of that in London. It's sort of a blank slate for me personally, but there is this family history. So that was something I felt very compelled to go back and dig up and explore.
Do you have a copy of the book there with you?
I do.
Because I was going to say, it's that moment. I don't know if you want to just read for a minute to give people a sense for what how beautifully this book reads. It's that moment where you realize that you're right behind your father's childhood home, that I think it kind of beautifully sets the stage for the rest of the book on page 36 in my edition.
All right, let me see if I can find.
If you feel like,
sure.
I think that's a beautiful passage.
All right. Let me see if I can find it. So yeah, I haven't looked at this I haven't figured this out, but I'll try for these couple of paragraphs here. Yeah. My father spent his earliest years in Sid and Ivy's first marital home, those are my grandparents, a 2-room flat on an upper floor of a house overlooking Camden Square, with a small kitchen in the corner of one room and a lavatory on the landing that was shared with the house's other occupants. The family lived in that cramped flat, with my father sleeping first in a drawer and then in a cot next to his parents' bed until he was about 3 years old, at which point they moved to a bigger flat on a street not far away, close to Holloway Women's Prison. And so, as I stepped onto the roof deck from the bedroom of the Muse house the realtor took me to, fantasizing a life in which I'd emerge in the morning with a cup of coffee in my hand and survey the landscape of narrow gardens and the backs of houses before descending to spend the day at my desk, I'd unwittingly been looking directly across at windows from which my father had surely looked out as a young boy in the arms of his mother. Coincidence is irrational, embarrassing, as clunky and unsubtle as the plot devices favored by Victorian authors, like the turn of events that reveals Magwitch, the fearsome escaped convict in Great Expectations, to be also the mysterious agent of Pip's prosperity, as well as the father of Estella, the cold-hearted, unreachable object of Pip's unrequited love. But coincidences happen even more frequently in life than they do in Victorian novels, and I have a taste for their numinous significance. To me, this collision of the past and the present on Camden Square, this invisible tracery in which the threads of my father's life and mine have, against all odds, crossed and interwoven, is charged, if not exactly with meaning, then with wonder. I don't know if my father would have marveled as I do at the story, though I doubt it. I can imagine giving him an account of my discovery as he sits in his armchair with the newspaper open in his liver-spotted hands, while I perch on the couch opposite, animatedly explaining my findings. Really, he says mildly, before turning back to his newspaper, as ever, not quite knowing what to do with me. What I am sure of is that my father would have wondered at his daughter being in a position even to consider buying a house in the once again affluent neighborhood where his parents stretched to afford a cramped cold water flat, surpassing even the greatest of her own expectations. There we are. I hope that gives a bit of a sense of it.
One of the things that made me think of was there's a line in Norman Rush's novel Mating where the character, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly what it was like, but the character said something like, you know, when you find yourself, when noticing a lot of coincidences, it's a sign that you're happy.
Wow.
And it struck me that this book in some ways is an elaboration of that idea.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Well, I think it's a sign of, I don't know if it's a sign of being, I'm not sure that it was not sure that it was a sign of me being happy, but it is a sign of feeling like things are lining up, isn't it? I mean, it's you know, that you're making a meaning out of the meaninglessness of your own ridiculous existence.
Yeah, and along those lines, I wanted to ask you, there's another line a little bit before that, where you talk about how the course of a life might turn upon a single act, one decision, and unrelinquished impulse. And before that, you had talked about your desire to get out of the seaside community where you grew up. I mean, in a way, I think that there's a bit of a tension there in this book between this idea of these irrevocable decisions one has made, and then the fact that, of course, as a person, you always are going to find some way to look back and make it all make sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think that there are not, most of the time you're deep in your life and you're just getting on with it. And, you know, going day to day and preoccupied with the, you know, going, like getting the school lunches ready tomorrow or meeting the deadline this afternoon or whatever. But every so often things happen that make you feel as if there is a story to your life. There's the shape of it, or the shape of an episode of it sometimes comes into focus. And I think that for me, moving countries at this moment, you know, in my early 50s, making this decision to uproot myself and do this different thing and uproot my family, then you know, that felt like a turn. You know, it felt like I mean, we use these phrases of, you know, chapters ending and so on, but you know, the shape of the previous 30 years starts to form, that becomes a discrete period of time, and a new thing begins. And so you have these moments that are sort of these liminal moments where you feel like your own, mostly formless existence is coming into focus, and then if you're a writer, you write it into shape, and you write it into focus.
Do you write diaries? I mean, are you a journal keeper? Because the stuff about your youth in New York was so vivid. I couldn't help but wonder if that was all from memory, or if you have records, or.
No, the amazing thing about that, I mean, I was in my youth an avid diary keeper, and I was a very dedicated diary keeper from, my early teens until my early 30s. And I then stopped for various reasons. And I regret it, and I wish I still did it, but I don't do it. What I regret even more than that is that the diaries that I did write were so much consumed with, my worries and my, heartbreak, and not at all about like the interesting people I met or the interesting things that those people said, which would be so much more interesting to now go back and look at. But what I do have is I wrote letters back to my parents in England for these 30 years. And they started out as, sort of a weekly airmail letter that I would send back. And then I went through a period of faxing letters to them when the fax machine was the thing that we all used. And then eventually it turned into email once my mother got a computer. But I wrote proper letters, and my mother, bless her, saved everyone and saved them in order. And so I have this archive of my own, my own past, but it's not that, mostly, thank God, I didn't burden them with the, the trauma of like stupid decisions I've made or whatever. They were a lot more about, oh, I went to this party and I saw this thing, and I went to, I went to Washington, D.C., or I did this or that. Or they were just like the description of office life, which was some of the stuff that made it into the book, of, the person, the gossip columnist from the Bronx at New York Magazine, where my first job, who used to mock my accent about me calling up as a fact checker and saying, I want to check some facts. And she would sort of say it with this very, very English accent. So yeah, all those little things are from, those are from letters. There's lots of these letters I haven't read, because there's only so much of your own digging into your own past that, certainly for me, there's only so much I can stand. So there are folders still unopened.
Well, I mean, along the lines of this move and this excuse, and the book as a kind of pretext for this sort of stock taking you're describing, or provisional stock taking, as all stock taking is. Are there experiences that you in going back through these letters, or thinking back through these times that you then rendered in this book, that you felt like you had a very different sense for their meaning or their numinous significance now than you ever would have ascribed to them at the time?
I mean, I think that everything that distance gives everything glamour. So the ordinariness of, I mean, this is not stuff that's from the book, but, just my first Rolodex, I don't know if you ever had a Rolodex, but, a card, a thing with cards with people's phone numbers on.
I'm aware of their existence, yeah.
Yeah, so that was what we used to use, before we had anything else to, and I got one of these, and my first job was as a fact checker, and so you needed a really good Rolodex. You needed people that you could call for everything, and I had this thing, and God knows I don't know if I still have it, but you could sort of flick through it, and there would be like Mario Cuomo's office number and Ed Koch's office number, and these all these people whose offices I had to call, and then just like these Diane von Furstenberg, well, she's still around, but all these like this Rolodex was like a picture, like a snapshot of the early 90s in New York, or at least as perceived through the lens of New York Magazine, where I worked at the time. A completely everyday kind of thing to have. But with hindsight, it's like something out of Mad Men. It's so strange and cool. So I think, wait long enough and your youth turns into somebody else's HBO series if you're lucky.
We've already gotten a couple of questions, so maybe we'll start with the questions and then see if we get more questions. So the first question is from Glenn Miller, who says, I, like many Americans, have come to feel that the United States has become very foreign to me, even while residing here. Any thoughts for Americans who may be seriously thinking of relocating to the UK or Europe, having lost faith in the US during the last 5 years? Would we be welcome? And is the grass greener or just a different shade? I love your writing.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Actually, literally, the grass is greener. Yeah, and without a doubt, in London, the grass is greener than in New York City. We have snowdrops already pushing up through the ground, and crocuses flowering everywhere, and the daffodils will probably be open by the time I get back from Italy. So, greener grass, leaves bursting. But the idea of there's something, isn't there, about this? When I was much younger and living in the UK, and Margaret Thatcher was elected for the third time, or whatever it was, I sort of can't stand this. I'm going to leave the country. And I luckily did get to go to America and did get to leave the country, not really because of Margaret Thatcher, but one has this feeling of wanting to make this grand gesture, and there was an element of that in our move, was sort of, we've just had it. We're going to go. Lots of people are saying they're going to go. We're really going to go. And actually, we weren't alone. I have a number of friends who left, Americans and otherwise, who've left in the last 4 or 5 years. One can't just move anywhere. You'd be welcome, Glenn, if you had the right paperwork to come and live in one of those places, and if not, you wouldn't. I think, look, it's a tremendous privilege, isn't it, to be able to go and live in another country, to have the right to go and live in another country. You, Gideon, I know have a bi-continental relationship, or however you phrase it, but we're very fortunate. We have options, and not everybody has options. But I think there's also really, really traumatizing and devastating to have to leave. Not to have to leave. I didn't have to leave, but to feel, like you've sort of had it with a place is really terribly hard. And then it's also just hard moving. Uprooting yourself at 21, as I did, was it's much easier than doing it at 51. But come on over, Glenn. We'd love to have you.
A similar sort of question from Paul Davis, who asks, did you ever give any thought to what it might have been like if your decision to uproot your family had involved somewhere other than back to the UK, somewhere much more different and unknown?
Yes, I did. My husband and I used to have, we would go, maybe like lots of people, we would travel to places and sort of think, maybe we could move here. And this was also pre the Brexit vote. I, as a British person, could have gone and lived anywhere in Europe. My husband more latterly has regained his Austrian citizenship, so he's now the EU citizen, and I am no longer. So we still have the continent, and we did think, well, especially when my son was younger. He's now 16, but when my son was more like the age of your son, we did think, well, what would it like? What would it be like if we were to move to Italy? You know, I don't speak Italian and or not terribly well, and you know, it's not I have no roots there, but love it. I'm there here. That's where I am right now. And we did think about it, but you know, ultimately, when it came the moment to do it, Britain seemed like the logical choice. We had the right to live there. It was easy enough. It was as easy as it was going to be to go anywhere would be to go to there. For me, in terms of work, I still work for the New Yorker. London seemed like a good place to be based, easy to get to other places and easy to navigate work-wise. So it made practical sense. And my son, who's 16, would have had a harder time in adjusting to a different language and a different culture at the age of 13 than he would have had at, say, 5.
Well, you do write in the one brief earlier move you made in the book when you went back for a job in the UK after your fact-checking gig was up. You write about how alienated you were from the spheres you were expected to have some familiarity with, and how difficult that made the reporting for you. And you actually, do you want to tell the wonderful story about the Viscount?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes. I moved back to England for 1 year in the early 90s, 1992, after I'd been in New York for 3 years and was a fact checker at New York Magazine, and had gotten to know a lot of, I was sort of the go-to person for journalists from London who were coming through and needed a fixer in some ways, because I knew the lie of the land a little bit. So I got to know lots of UK journalists, and one of them was somebody who worked at the Sunday Times in London, who encouraged me to apply for a job back in London, working there, writing a sort of society column, not a party column really, not a gossip column, party column, and I did it. Because I wanted to be a full-time writer, not a fact checker, and I wasn't getting promoted at the job that I was at. So I thought, well, I'll go back. And I also thought, I've been 3 years in New York. Maybe it's time to go back to proper life and go back to London and find out what that's like, and give up my New York life. So I went and worked at the Sunday Times, and I immediately knew, from week one, pretty much, that it was a terrible mistake, and that the place itself was kind of toxic, and I wasn't happy doing the work, mostly because I didn't know at all who or what I was supposed to be reporting on. There was this sort of fascination, as there remains in the British press, with the aristocracy, but I didn't know who any of these people were. And I didn't know who British celebrities were, because I'd sort of been out of the loop and didn't know what was on TV and all those things. And but I was supposed to sound kind of knowing and write about these people, and I really didn't. I was clueless, and it was a sort of miserable experience. But there was this one night where, and the other context of this is that this was, I worked for the Sunday Times in the year in which they published the Andrew Morton book, Diana, Her True Story, which at the time wasn't known to be based on interviews with Princess Diana, but it blew the Diana marriage, Charles and Diana's marriage, wide open. Big scandal, all-consuming story, and I worked at the paper where that had happened. So the story is I'm at a party. I'm invited to a party, and I'm introduced to Viscount Linley, who is the son of Princess Margaret. And at the time, he was probably, 11th in line to the throne. He's much further down the line now, but he was Princess Margaret's son, quite high up. I'm introduced to him, and then so I leave the party. I'm trying to get a cab home, and the Viscount comes up on his motorbike, and he rides a motorbike and offers me a ride home. And so I get on the back of the bike. He's got a spare helmet. I put on his spare helmet and I've got my arms around his waist. And he says to me, "What is it you do again?" And I had to tell him, "I'm a journalist for the Sunday Times that just published this story about your family. Do you want me to get off the bike?" And he was like, no. It's just interesting to know who you know, what you're like. And then he drove me home, and that was the end of the story. He dropped me off outside he didn't want to know that much about what I was like. But it was very, you know, in the Crown era, you know, the idea that one could imagine the royal members of the royal family sort of looking at journalists and reading the newspapers, thinking, "God, I wonder who these people are that write this crap," you know. And there he was finding out who this person was who wrote the crap next to the crap, you know. Him I recognized. I did know who he was. He was high enough up the social ladder, but yeah.
But I brought it up in part because I think it's a great story and I wanted you to tell it. But the question was going to be whether obviously this time you were not returning exclusively to write about the UK, and you were certainly not writing party reports. But did you feel a similar level of estrangement and defamiliarization, or was the fact of, you know, the internet that wouldn't have existed back then? I mean, did you feel like it was much easier just to step right into the stream of British culture?
In some ways, it's much easier, obviously, because you know, I've been on a dual track in a way for a long time, and because London is so cosmopolitan, it's so international that, you know, it doesn't feel like moving back into you know, the shires. It's you know, the people I know are, you know, between New York and London and Paris and Berlin and everywhere else too. And there, you know, lots of people I know are not British, or they're half British, or they're, you know, quasi-British. So it doesn't feel quite like such an alien, quite like such an alien world. And I figured out a little bit more about the aristocracy than I used to know. I've read more books, and, you know, and it also turns out that I can write about the royal family forever and find out that I have things to say. That year in London, you know, during the Queen's Annus Horribilis, somehow like imprinted itself deep. And so I've got all sorts of opinions. Yeah. Don't ask me about Prince Andrew. You'll never shut me up.
We have another question. What things do you prefer about living in the UK, and what do you miss most about being in New York?
What I miss most about being in New York is my family, for sure. My husband is American, and I have a beloved sister-in-law in New York. I have a beloved brother-in-law in New York, and another one in California. I have 3 stepsons, my husband's older sons, who are all still in the States, not all in New York. And you know, and missing the proximity to them is really hard. And it was never the plan to move to the UK and then not be able to come visit for 2 years, which was my COVID experience. I think the only way that you can persuade yourself to do such a, you know, ridiculous thing is to sort of pretend like it's not really happening. So I felt like I'd moved once from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and I thought, well, it's just a little bit further, you know, it's just like, it's crossing the East River, but bigger, and I'll be back all the time. It's not such a big deal. That was how I persuaded myself that it was an okay thing to do. And of course, that's the story that you have to tell yourself. So I miss that. And I miss, you know, I feel like the terrible thing about the last couple of years is that what I miss is the past. You know, what I miss is 2015. And I've felt anguished for New York, and I have felt, you know, bereft of what I had in the life that I had. And but I know for sure that that's not you know, that's not the life that has continued in the last couple of years. I have been back, and I lived for many years in Fort Greene, just around the corner from where you live, and there's that. It's very strange to go back to a place that you have really loved. I really loved it, and my family home there is still in some ways the place that if you ask me what home is, that's what I think of as home. But now when I go back, it's like, after you've broken up with somebody, a long enough time passes and you can still see what there was, but you don't quite feel it in the same way that you did.
And you haven't even seen the really big tower that they built now.
No, I'll be back in.
And more disorienting next time you're.
Is that the one at the base of Junior? Above, right? Yeah. Can't wait.
The other half of that question was, what do you prefer about living in the UK?
Oh, there's a kind of the last time I was back in New York, which was over the summer, I was walking along the West Side Highway, where I used to go a lot because I used to live in Soho and go up and down the West Side Highway all the time. And it was early evening, beautiful evening, and the promenade there was full of people running, or basically everybody, or biking, but it was mostly young people. It was an awful lot of young men with waxed chests running, looking like, sort of superhuman in some sense, and working on themselves, working on their body and their well-being with as much effort as they put into their job on Wall Street, which is where they were all working for sure. And there was a kind of brutal commitment to work that struck me as such a contrast with walking along the south bank of the Thames at the same time of the evening, along past the the National Theatre or the Royal Festival Hall, and this beautiful vista across London, and all the people on along that promenade are sitting around having a drink and talking and relaxing. And that there's something about, it's not that people don't work in London, of course they do, but there is something about the value that is placed upon things that aren't work, pleasure, conversation, culture, the arts even, that I really, it is wonderful to be reminded that, that kind of, it's all about work mentality that was so much part of my, for sure, how I spent my early career. It's nice to be reminded of other kinds of fellowship.
What, as you were to return to something you were saying before about how, this was a book whose form you were kind of making up as you went along, or figuring out what shape it should take as you went along. Were there models you looked to that, that you hoped might help, this book find its way?
Well, there were books I read and reread. You mentioned Sebald, everybody mentioned Sebald, and I'd looked again at that work. I'm trying to think what else. Oh goodness, everything is vanishing out of my head. I was reading some memoirs, but I was also reading fiction, sort of auto fiction. This isn't that, but but the ways in which novelists were writing, Rachel Cusk or whomever would sort of write a fictionalized version of life as it was lived. So looking at, examples of being able to write, I hope that the book coheres as a, as a as I say, like as a sense of mood and a sense of metaphor and memory and those kinds of feelings. Like I say, it's not a straightforward, you know, this is my travelogue. This is, you know, this is like how the experience changed over time. It's really not like that. It's much more circling around these ideas of what it is to be at home or not to feel at home, or so yeah. But I'm not very. I don't have a list. I should have like 5 books I read, but I can't even turn to them on my shelf because I'm in a hotel room. So they're probably behind you on your shelf.
I have no idea what's behind me on my shelf. Stuff just piles up there. Do we have any final questions from the audience or from Helen? I think we're getting close to the end of the hour, and I know that it's nearing midnight where you are in Naples. So I don't want to detain you over the time we have.
I think that's it for the questions. So
That's great.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca and Gideon, for sharing a wonderful discussion with us tonight. Rebecca, thank you for staying up so late.
Yep. We have one more question, which Marie asks, has your book been translated? But she doesn't specify into what.
Great question, because it has been translated from American to English. It's being published in Britain in April. And my British publisher said to me, you know, is it okay if we give it to a British reader to go through and, you know, like alter some things? So I don't write British English anymore. I write American English or something between the two. And so I had to have somebody read it to turn every apartment into flat and every, I don't know, elevator into lift and every aluminum into aluminium. And it's weird for me to read the British, you know, to look at the British text, because it's really not how I speak or write anymore. But yeah, so that's the only translation. Beyond that, I don't know. No, not yet. I hope it would be nice if it were.
Well, Marie hopes it's going to be in German and or French.
Marie, call your publisher friends in both those countries and ask them, please, to I would be delighted to have that happen.
Anyway, back to you, Helen. Sorry.
Thanks. We'll forward that request on to Knopf.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you both for a wonderful discussion tonight. A reminder to all of you that copies of Homeland are available at Oblong Books and online at oblongbooks.com. Before we close, I'd like to extend our thanks to Erin Hartman and Olivia Decker of Knopf for helping make this event happen. And I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to join us. And with that, we'll say goodnight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
everyone. This was wonderful. Thanks.